Thank you, Mayor Simmons and Jen. Now we will turn our attention to Capitol Hill. John Laughner, Government Relations Manager at the American Heart Association, is here to provide an update on what's happening in Congress with respect to appropriations for cardiovascular health. John?
All right. Well, thank you, John. I appreciate the introduction. It's a real honor and privilege to be able to present today to the National Forum for Heart Disease and Stroke Prevention. We've been a longtime supporter of this group with the American Heart Association, and so always a pleasure to meet with the members. Today, I plan to do a congressional update and give you a sense of what we're seeing for funding for the cardiovascular disease and research programs and the prevention programs at the National Institute and CDC, National Institute of Health. So let me go ahead and get our slide kicked off here. So this is the current funding situation for the National Institute of Health and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. They went ahead and appropriated $47.5 billion for the National Institutes of Health, which is a $2.5 billion increase over the previous fiscal year. Also in that legislation, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention received a $9.2 billion in funding, which is an increase of $760 million over the previous fiscal year. And so I created this slide where you can see the funding trends over the last years since FY 2019. And, as they say, elections have consequences. And so I think and also, where the funding is dedicated also dictates priorities of the different parties. So as you can see with these numbers, the National Institutes of Health over the last 5 years have seen its budget increase by 21%. The CDC has also done fairly well. Before the elections took place, the Congress was able to pass one last appropriations bill under Democratic control. And Congresswoman Delora made it very clear that she felt like public health had really not been appropriately funded over decades. And we saw the ramifications of that, during the pandemic. And so if you look at these funding numbers, you can see where she did attempt to increase, investments in these programs. So, for example, the Division for Heart Disease and Stroke Prevention over the last 5 years saw a 10.7% increase. The Wise Woman program saw a 64% increase in that program. So in 2019, the Wise Woman program was able to fund about 21 states. Right now, they're getting ready to launch a new grant competition for Wise Woman. And the hope is with these large increases to the program, we can get from about 26, 27 states to up to 40 states participating in the Wise Woman program, which helps. The Million Hearts program saw a 25% increase in just this last fiscal year when they increased the program's budget from $4 million to $5 million. And then the racial and ethnic approaches to community health also saw a 23% increase in its funding over the last 5 years. So, I kind of have framed this presentation as the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so this is the good. This is, what has taken place over the last 5 years. Large investments in the NIH, large investments in the CDC, and the programs that we really care about. But I want to kind of paint a clear picture. And this slide was presented by Dr. Gary Gibbons from the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. And it shows even with these investments into the NIH, you can see because of inflationary pressures over the last 10 years, you can see the funding for an average award cost of an R01 grant. So if you look at FY 2016, the average cost was about $523,000 a year. Over time, it's increased to $640,000 per grant. And so, that's sort of, showing the inflationary pressures that's being put on the NIH. Congress has been able to just basically keep up with inflation. Before I kind of delve into what to expect this year with appropriations, I wanted to talk about some new initiatives that have passed that are relevant to this group. So last year, the Carroll Act was passed in December by unanimous vote on both the House and Senate side. This legislation was named in honor of Congressman Andy Barr's wife, Carol Barr, who passed away from a sudden cardiac arrest at the age of 39. This legislation would help understand the condition that she had. She had a condition called mitral valve prolapse, or also known as floppy valve syndrome. And for some individuals, this condition can be very severe. There's millions of people who have mitral valve prolapse in the United States, but and can live a normal life. But unfortunately, there's a small subset of patients who actually are at high risk of sudden cardiac arrest. And unfortunately, the medical community and the research community are not familiar or do not have enough information to provide guidelines for doctors to actually screen for these patients who have severe mitral valve prolapse. So this would fund the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute with $20 million per year over the next 5 years. And also provide $8 million to the CDC per year for 5 years to expand the cardiac arrest registry to enhance survival, or CARES. And then also to expand or to create a public education and outreach program on valve disease. And so both of those things, while the Carroll Act is now the law of the land, because of the work of Congress, they actually funded this for the first time as well in December. So, my boss, Emily Halewich, is always, bragging about how it's very irregular for a bill to pass and then also be funded in the first year. So we're really proud that took place, and that funding is going to be available immediately. So my understanding is the cardiac arrest registry program will be eligible for funding later this year, closer to September. And then the NHLBI will launch its research portfolio later this year as well. And then one last thing, I couldn't talk to this group without mentioning the Access to the AEDs Act, which was just introduced in March. This legislation would help K through 12 schools purchase AED devices and provide CPR training to student staff, coaches, principals, anyone in a school building. And this was a result because of the recent sudden cardiac arrest of Damar Hamlin on national television before Monday Night Football, that this bill has actually gained national attention. And so the American Heart Association actually did an event with Damar Hamlin just last month, where he came to Washington, D.C. And expressed his support for the bill. We now have major endorsements from the National Football League, the NCAA, the National Association of Secondary School Principals, American Red Cross, American Heart Association. And so this is where putting a lot of our attention. So now the bad. And so where are we, what is going on with Congress right now under the new leadership of Speaker McCarthy? So this week, the House passed the Limit, Save, Grow Act, which is legislation to extend the debt limit of the United States government by a narrow vote of 217 to 215. The legislation would basically restrict Congress from funding the government at levels above FY22. So I just reviewed some of the numbers for FY23. And so the ramifications of these cuts would basically mean that Congress would have to find at least $142 billion within its budget to get down to FY22 levels. And then unfortunately, the belief is that Congress has, or at least the House Republicans have no intention of finding those cuts just within across the board, across all federal agencies, including the Department of Defense, Veterans Affairs, and then also all the domestic programs. The sort of the what we expect is that they will actually make those cuts strictly to non-defense programs. So the ramifications of that is that we would see 22% cuts across programs, specifically for this group, the Department of Health and Human Services, CDC, and the National Institutes of Health. And so, what are the ramifications of that? I did some work with the Division for Heart Disease and Stroke Prevention to come up with some numbers. This is something that we're starting to really review, is like, what would the ramifications be of that for programs that we care about? And the division's reporting that if they were have to cut their budget by 20%, it would mean eliminating 10 states from the Division for Heart Disease and Stroke Prevention's cardiovascular disease prevention program. So, as I mentioned, the Wise Woman program has done fairly well over the last few years and is expanding and getting ready to run a new grant competition. But under these restrictions, we would see them go from about 27 states down to 22 states if they were to resort back to previous funding levels.
So John, if I may, it's clear that real cuts will have real consequences. I'm wondering if we can focus on what actions the people who are participating in this meeting today and their organizations can take.
Right. One of the easiest things to do is to engage with the American Heart Association and our grassroots network, our Year the Cure network. We send messages to Congress on a wide variety of legislative issues. The American Heart Association will be submitting a communication to Capitol Hill and against these cuts. But like I said, your members need to be really starting to think about what the ramifications of these cuts really look like at the state and local level. And so the more that they can actually put a face to the ramifications of these cuts, the more that we can actually make headway and cutting off any potential cuts that are coming down the road.
And John, if we haven't already signed up, how do we do that?
Yeah, so if you go to the American Heart Association's website, you can find our Year the Cure network and sign up to be an advocate. We have multiple campaigns going on, like I mentioned, the Access to AEDs Act. I anticipate we'll have a Year the Cure message for passing an appropriations bill that does not make 22% cuts to programs. So be on the lookout for that. But I know your members are members of lots of different organizations that are related to their own interests. So you definitely encourage you to engage with those members. I know the American Lung Association has an advocacy department that's very active. I know the directors of the public health officials, ASTO, has a very active advocacy program. So look for many different avenues to make your voice heard. So, definitely over the next month or so, I think you're going to see things really ramping up in this space. So just keep an eye out and really, try to participate as much as possible.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And John, I think I'm hearing you say that there's a real threat of deep cuts in funding for heart disease and stroke prevention on the immediate horizon, and that progress that you showed when you were talking about the good before we got to the bad,
Right.
that's all at risk of being wiped out. So I think I'm hearing you say that it's never been more important for all of us to get out onto the playing field and be in contact with members of Congress and staff and activate members for organizations who have them, to get everybody we can involved. Is that a fair summation?
I think that was very succinct, John. I couldn't have said it better myself. And thank you for inviting me here today. And if there's things that we can do in our federal advocacy office to help facilitate, that engagement, feel free to reach out to us. We're definitely active in this space right now.
Well, that's a generous offer. Really appreciate it. And John, I know from my personal experience that working with you personally and with the American Heart Association over the years, you really know what you're doing. You're highly effective, as those increasing graphs show.
Mhm.
And so we appreciate the opportunity to throw in with you and help advocate for the best appropriations outcomes that we can achieve.
Well, thank you, John. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining us today, John. John Laughner.
Thanks, John.